Have you ever sat on your porch in the cool of the evening as the stars are just starting to speckle the sky, and you look up and watch the planes go by in their flight path to DIA? You hear the flaps come down and the wheels lower into place, maybe even lock into place. And ever wondered, how in the world do they stay in the air? I remember as a boy, we were living in Midwest City, and we were on the landing path to Tinker Air Force Base. And my brother and I, we would play in the backyard, and when those planes would come down, they would get really low, and I could see the tread on the tires, those big AWACS airplanes as they were coming in. They were so massive and so big, and you kind of think to yourself, how in the world does an airplane stay in the air? Tonight, we're going to get into a little physics. I like physics, as long as it's easy. But imagine yourself one of those big jumbo jets, right? And the wings are out here, and you see them flying overhead, but today you actually have to get on one. Isn't that one of the funnest things to do, get on an airplane? I know some people are nervous about it. They see the winds blowing before the plane's even moving, and they look out the wing on that plane, and it's already starting to bob. Have you ever noticed that? And if you watch them when they're taking off, the wings go up long before the body of that airplane does, right? And we instinctively know that the wings are important. Without the wings, what do you have? A bus, right? And so we need the wings. But think about flight. Think about what it means to get an airplane like that into the air. You realize that in physics, there's 4 forces that have to come into a balance in order to get an airplane into the air. And so tonight we're actually going to talk about those 4 forces. And the reason why is because in a lot of ways, Christians are like the airplane. If you think about such verses as Isaiah 40, verses 30 and 31, what does it say? It says that they shall run and not grow weary, right? Shall walk and not faint. Why? Because they shall mount up with wings like eagles, right? God's people soar. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's purposeful that God talks about the Christian life soaring, and it also talks about God being above us. And the idea is as we're soaring, we're actually drawing closer and closer to God. I realize that we're not actually talking about real altitude here. We know that God is not somewhere up in the heavens, and if we could get up to cruising altitude 30,000 feet in an airplane, but if we could get all the way up to 90,000 feet, then we'll be in heaven. We know it's not a location like that, but the idea is that God is implanting in our minds that He is above. And that the best we can do here on this earth is that we can soar toward Him in heaven, and then ultimately one day obtain that great gift and that great honor that comes with that. But when we think about these forces, the first thing that we have to understand is there's this one force pulling us down. What is that? Gravity, right. Gravity is that force that when you talk about large objects have this ability to pull things or have things gravitate toward them physically. It's not something you can just by wish or will overcome. It doesn't matter how much you want to overcome gravity without applying these particular forces, you'll never do it. As a kid, I thought, hey, I'll tie a towel around my neck and I will jump off the pole barn and I'll fly just like Superman. And you know what happened? I hit the ground. That was okay. I messed up on the first time, right? And so I climbed back up on top of the barn with my towel and I jumped again. But this time I really, 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 really wanted to fly. And you know what happened? I hit the ground. Because gravity is always there. Isaac Newton was absolutely right. Well, in the Christian's life, there is a force that is constantly trying to pull us down. We often refer to it as the devil, right? The devil is constantly pulling us down. I think of 1 Peter 5 and verse 8 where it says that he is our adversary, right? He is against us. And where God is trying to get us to soar through the heavens and draw closer to him, the devil is trying to pull us down, to pull us into this earth, to take us away from God so that we would lose the blessings that God would give to us. But he pulls and he pulls and he pulls. He pulls on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. In fact, he pulls us down on every day ending with Y. That's just the way he is. He goes on in 1 Peter 5:8 to say that he is as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. The book of Job opens with this wonderful scene of God, and the devil comes to the counsel of God, and God says, well, where have you been? And the devil says, I have been on the earth walking to and fro. The devil takes upon an adversarial role. In fact, the word Satan, which is a Hebrew word, actually means adversary. It means one who is adversarial to us. He's against us. And it's as if there's this court of heaven that is now adjourned. And God is there, and we would say even the second person of the Godhead, the Son is there, the Spirit is there, court is now in session, and the devil shows up, and the devil is there as the prosecutor to tear us down. He is our adversary. And the very next words out of God's mouth was, have you considered my servant Job? But you get this picture that the devil is this force that is there to pull us down. And even though he has been tied with a chain and cast into the bottomless pit in Revelation 20, that he still continues to exert a great influence on this world. And a lot of people will never take flight as a Christian because the devil has them anchored to the ground. That's the first force we've got to contend with if we're going to fly as a Christian. Before we take flight, we've also got to recognize there's another force acting upon us. We call this force drag. It's if you're in an airplane, you're moving through the fluid or the air, which itself causes friction on the airplane and tries to push it back. You ever drive by an airport, one of those small municipal airports, and they got those little Cessnas and Bonanzas and Cherokees all lined up out there, and you ever wonder why they're not just floating in the air? I mean, they've got wings, right? Why aren't they just floating in the air? Well, because gravity's there. Well, I want them to go. Well, so you get in the airplane and you sit there. Does it fly then? No, there's too much friction between the tires and the pavement. There's too much drag holding this airplane in place. You see, it can't just all of a sudden jump into the air. That's not what flight takes. You've got to overcome the forces of drag that tend to keep it in place. One of the laws of physics is that an object in motion will continue in motion until what? Until it's acted upon by sufficient force. And the corollary to that is an object at rest will stay at rest. There's too much drag in the fluid mechanics of the world. You know, as Christians, we also have a drag force. We often refer to it simply as the world, right? So we take, for instance, 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33 says that evil companions can corrupt good morals, right? That the people that we run with, our friends and our neighbors, our relatives sometimes, that they can be a drag on our lives while we are trying to soar toward heaven, take flight from this earth and get into God's presence. We have those around us who are pulling us back, right? They think it's strange that you run not with them into the same excess of riot we see, for example, in 1 Peter 4 and verse 4. They don't want you to leave them behind. So they pull on you and they tempt you not to go away from them. But it's not just the people. While that's a big part of it, I think a lot of us as Christians, that's one of the biggest things that holds us back are the people in our lives. That's why, when we talk to kids, when we talk to them about, when they're looking for a spouse and they're thinking about a boyfriend or a girlfriend or something like that, it is important to start looking for someone that will help you soar instead of that will anchor you down. And let me tell you something, the devil is trying to get you to choose someone that will hold you down. And if you're trying to be a Christian, they may be successful in pulling you away from God. So we've got to look at someone who's going to help us get to heaven. And the way we're going to find someone like that is that we need to be someone who's going to help someone else get to heaven, to help them soar, because the people, the relationships we have are one of the biggest drags that we have. There's another drag besides the world, I would say, is even our sin. Think of Hebrews chapter 12 in verse 1 when he says to lay aside every sin, some translations, every weight or encumbrance. What are weight and encumbrances? There are things that are obstacles to us. They hold us back. You think of ankle weights. Some of you may remember the fad of putting ankle weights on in the morning as you start your day and doing all your walking, all your exercises. I used to, when I was practicing baseball, I would wear ankle weights during practice. So when game time came around, I'd take them off. Man, I felt like I was flying right then. I've laid aside the encumbrance. That's what the Hebrew writer is telling us to do. Lay aside the encumbrance. Lay aside the things that are bringing friction and dragging you down. Well, what is it? In that context, he's specifically talking about our sin. Our sin is a drag to our lives, and it anchors us down because it's the chain, basically, that anchors to the devil himself. We've got to overcome those two forces. Those are the things that keep us from flying when we jump off the barn with a towel cape. Those two forces are the ones that keep the airplanes on the ground. So what do? Well, we've got to overcome this force of drag somehow. And we produce another force that we call thrust. Right? Thrust. That's the forward movement that will eventually create the next force, which is lift. Now, in airplanes, we do that through propellers and engines or jet engines, anything that produces enough forward force to overcome or counteract drag. And if it produces enough force, it can create the lift needed to soar. If the devil is pulling me down and the world is holding me back, I'm the one that is thrusting forward. I'm the one that is going to be reaching toward my goal. So that's ourself. And we think of there's a lot of different passages that we might put in here. For example, in Philippians 2 and verse 12, where he says to work out your own salvation. You have an obligation to exert some energy, to produce some thrust, to move forward. In fact, he will go on in Philippians 3, in verses 12 through 14, when he says, not as though I've already obtained these things I've left behind. I press on forward toward the mark of the prize, the high calling of God. What is he doing? He's talking about running a race, and he's bearing down on the finish line. He says, I'm pressing forward. I'm not worried about what's behind me. I'm overcoming the drag of the world. I'm overcoming the drag of my sin, and I'm pressing. I'm creating the thrust in order to win that race. And that's exactly where God wants us to be, pushing forward to that moment. Well, how do we do that? Well, you see that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only. James chapter 2 and verse 24. We've got to be doing something. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest. If I'm a Christian and I'm at rest and I'm not working, I'm going to stay at rest. Airplanes at rest never fly. Christians at rest will never fly. This life was not created for us. This abundant life, as Jesus calls it in John chapter 10, this abundant life that we're called to is a life of service, a life of doing, a life of action. And so we find our place. This morning we talked about if just a cup of water is all you can give that cup of water. Be the servant of God. And do what you can, even if it's small. I think sometimes we want to do something big for God. Big. Want everyone to see it. And while we're trying to find the big thing to do, all the little things that God needs done go left undone. Now here's one of the most fascinating parts about flight to me. In order to actually fly, that wing can't just be a flat board. Because let me tell you, I tried this too. My parents, so we used to tear down houses for the lumber, and we would get these big 1x12 shiplap boards, with nails all in them, and my mom and dad would actually. By the way, my mom's here today. I don't know if y'all got to say hi to my mom this morning or tonight, but so they would pay us to pull nails out of those boards. And we'd have these long 1x12s, and I thought, if anything's going to make me fly, it's that board. Let me tell you, when you jump off a barn with a board, you can hurt your knees and other parts of your body at the same time. The flat board doesn't do it. If you ever notice on the wings, if you're in an airplane or you're on the sidelines looking at them, they have this nice curve on the top, right? And on the bottom, depending on if they have a symmetrical or an asymmetrical air design, they'll either be flat or they'll be semi-flat, maybe not as big a curve. But some of them, like stunt planes, they kind of have to have a big curve on the bottom side too. But that they call that the airfoil. And here's what happens. This is what's neat. So as the airplane is going forward, as there's thrust going, it creates wind movement over the wing, right? And so traveling over this curved surface, that surface, if you were just to put a tape measure on it, is longer than the surface on the other side. And so the wind going underneath the wing is going much slower than the wind going over the wing, because it parts and they meet back at the same spot, but this one has to travel further over the curve than this one on the flat stuff. It's pretty neat. And what they can also do is make it cause some turbulence underneath there, which is even more air pressure. So the slower moving air has a higher air pressure than the faster moving air on the top, causing it to rise, to lift up. The further you go, or the faster you go, I should say, the more that turbulence on the bottom side builds up and pushes higher and lifts the plane into the air. And that becomes that last force. We have liftoff, right? It's a wonderful thing. Well, we've got a force in our lives as Christians to help Christians take flight. In fact, it is the same power that without the power of lift, it doesn't matter how fast you're going forward. It doesn't matter how much drag you overcome. It doesn't matter how much you try to jump off the ground. You will still never fly until the power of lift comes into play. And that's God. God is the one who reaches down and lifts us up, who gives us the power and the opportunity to soar with Him. All things work together for good for those who love the Lord. What's the promise there? That God is going to bless us. He's going to lift us out of the struggles and the trials of the world. He's going to lift us into His air zone, we might say. They work together. That's how God works in our lives, and He continues to work over and over. Greater is He that is in you than he that is in the world. Greater is the God who is lifting you up than the devil who is pulling you down. Turn, if you would, for just a moment to Exodus 19. We're just going to look at 4 and 5. The children of Israel have left the lands of Egypt. They're traveling through what we often refer to as the Sinaitic Peninsula. They're looking for this opportunity to serve God. They haven't got to the point where they've received the law yet. They're still wondering how things are going to happen. And God speaks to Moses. We'll go back actually to verse 3. It says, the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell all the people of Israel. So here's what God wants Moses to tell them. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you will speak to the people. That verse 6, we are reminded of course, 1 Peter 2, that we are a royal priesthood, a peculiar people of God's own possession. But I just want to look at 4 ideas here. And the first one is, God has chosen them as his people among who? Among all the people, among the entire world. You're my chosen ones. God's chosen people today is the church. And the thing that threatens the church is the drag of the whole world. You ever thought about that? That's the drag force. God says, I want you to remember how I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And he says, I want you to remember, not that I brought you out, but first he says, what I did to the Egyptians. Well, what did God do to the Egyptians? Go back to Exodus chapter 15, the great Song of Moses. We sing about the Song of Moses in the Lamb by and by sometimes in our songs. Well, there is a Song of Moses, and it's actually recorded for us in Exodus 15. And it's where Moses begins to recount the deeds of God when he brought them by a strong arm out of the land of Egypt. And he says of the Egyptians, about verse 4, he starts talking about how he's dealt with them, and he says that he brought the waters back over them. Here's the Red Sea has been parted, and the water comes back, and it buries them, and it says that the Egyptians sank. They went down. That's the gravity. The enemy. In that case, the Egyptians, but for the Christian, it's also the devil. The devil's wanting to pull us down. That's the other force. But then God says, we overcame those, right? He says, what? I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. You know, I lifted you up. While they were sinking under gravity, I lifted you by grace. And then what does he tell them? Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. What's he telling them? Now you do your part. I've done mine. I can bear you up as long as necessary. Just do your part. Give the thrust. Supply the energy. How's that? Keeping my covenant. Here's the promise. I realize this is God speaking to Israel, but is it not true that God promises us that we can take flight? We're Christians, and we can soar on wings of eagles, just as the children of God were promised then, if we will do our part to follow the word of God, to obey him each and every day, serving him, loving others, and serving others. That's how we do this. And in that way, we can take flight. So where are you? Are you on the runway? Are you outside the plane, just outside the fence, watching them take off? thinking, oh, I wish I could fly? Are you in the air? In the holding pattern with God? You see, this is where we have to assess my spirituality. What have I been doing? And honestly, we know what kind of energy and thrust we've put into it, haven't we? You sit here, I don't know what you've put in, but you know what you've put in. I know what I've put in. And I'm going to continue running for God as much as I can because I want to fly on the wings of eagles. Not on a towel cape, not on shiplap board. I want to fly on the wings of God. If you desire that and you need to change the direction of your life to soar with Him, Christian, take flight. If you're not a Christian, then come and get your wings tonight while we stand and while we sing.